Hey everyone, Rico Berg, realtor with BRIDGEWELL Real Estate Group, and today I have a lovely notary here, Paul Choi from Juris Notary, and we are going to be talking about a really interesting and also very relevant topic right now. So we're going to be talking about subject-free offers. I can always give you guys my perspective on a subject-free offer from a real estate side of things, but I think that from a legal side of things is where it becomes a little bit more interesting, because a lot of the risks with subject-free offers end up being legal matters. So that's why I brought Paul on today, just to go over some common questions that we get and go through some examples and hopefully give you guys all the information that you need when it comes to subject-free offers. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, Paul, introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me, Mariko, and hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to tune in and look at me talk about subject-free offers, which might be interesting, maybe not, but I'll try my best. Of course, I currently am a managing partner at Juris Notary office. Our main office is located in Coquitlam, Burnaby area, and we have a secondary office in Abbotsford to serve those who are in Fraser Valley area. So Mariko have asked me to talk about subject-free today. It is definitely an interesting topic that I get questions on it quite a bit. And it comes in waves, I find that, of course, it starts to creep up when market turns to a seller's market. And as buyers, you're having to compete for a property. And of course, it's used quite a bit when you are having to give an offer that you think is more attractive and more competitive in order to have an edge over others.
Mm-hmm. So for those of you that might not be familiar with the term already, essentially when we have a real estate contract and we come to an acceptance, there's a period of time called the subject removal process. And it's essentially the time for you to do your due diligence, but it also acts as a safety net for you to be able to back out of the deal if, for example, you can't get financing or you aren't satisfied with the inspection, things like that. Whereas when we're doing a subject-free offer, we basically are just saying it's a done deal today. I'm handing in my deposit, and I don't have this safety net time period to necessarily back out of the deal. But Paul, do you have anything else to add in terms of like what is a subject-free offer and the nature of it from a legal perspective?
Yeah, so subject-free offer, essentially offer is a contract. It's a contract that doesn't have any condition attached to it. For the most part in BC, when a person, a buyer, writes a contract offer to a seller to say, I want to offer you X number of dollars to buy this property, but of course, given that it's a big purchase, I want to have some time to be able to check on different parts of the property before I actually commit to it. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing a subject-free offer, though, it's unconditional contract that becomes binding immediately as soon as seller accepts, which means you can't walk away and you can't back out for any reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that when it comes to subject-free offers, like I talk about it in terms of being able to do your like due diligence or time to do your due diligence, but it doesn't necessarily mean like when you write a subject-free offer, I guess as a realtor, like we still want to do our due diligence. We still want to review that title search, the property disclosure statement, or maybe get a pre-inspection beforehand. But I think the biggest thing with subject-free offers is like there's some things that you can only do once you have an accepted offer. Like, for example, like financing appraisals and things like that. So that's kind of where it becomes risky business. But can you talk about what the risks are of putting in a subject-free offer legally?
Yeah, you kind of touched on it there a little bit. And the reason the risk comes from subject-free offer is, of course, because typically you are having to write a subject-free offer when it's competitive and you are trying to get an edge over other buyers bidding to buy a specific property. So typically it's very time sensitive, it's very time constrained. And realistically, you might have seen the house and it could be within a couple of hours. typically, I would imagine within at most a day or two, you're having to put that offer in, and you're trying to, it's so competitive that you're having to put it in free offer. And that typically doesn't give you sufficient time to do certain checks. So there's no time to do inspections. As you said, you may not have time to do any mortgages, any deficiencies in the condos, to see if there's any big issues or repairs that's coming down the pipe. You may not even have time to do title searches or to see if the condo or the property is being sued. And you might be taking on that liability. And so those sort of risks are all there, and more often than not, you're in a position where you have to write an offer and being committed to it without fully having enough time to do all those checks and being fully satisfied and having full knowledge as to what you're actually buying.
Yeah. And I like in my world right now, and I'm sure you're seeing this a lot, like the detached market in Greater Vancouver and Fraser Valley areas are absolutely insane. Absolutely. So standard subject removal period that we would see in like a perfect world is 7 days long. Yep. And we're seeing all these subject free offers. So I have this one client, for example, offer after offer after offer everywhere from Port Coquitlam to Maple Ridge in the detached market. Everything ended up going subject free. There was one home that we wrote on that was 21 offers. There's another home that we wrote on that was 15 offers. And these are like hundreds of thousands of dollars above the listing price. And they end up going subject free, and some with the deposit in hand. And for many of those properties, like because there were so many showings and the property's only on the market for the matter of a week, they only give you 15-minute time windows to view the property. And there were very, very few that allowed people to come back for pre-offer inspections, if they even wanted them. And a lot of them, because they were tenanted properties, didn't even allow access for an inspection, and they still went subject free. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I think that like really the big risk comes down to like, what if something goes wrong in terms of you not being able to complete? And I think for me, when I think about this, it's more so from a financing perspective. If something goes wrong with your financing, or it can't appraise properly and you don't have the difference in the down payment to be able to make up the difference between appraised value and what you paid for it, it gets a little bit complicated. So if for some reason the buyer is not able to complete on the property that they've got an accepted offer on subject free, they've already handed in the deposit, and then they come to you and they're like, oh, damn, I can't complete. What does that actually mean for the buyer?
Yeah, so we see that a lot right now in BC, where it seems like detached homes are really hot. And some condos, especially pre-sale condos, is not so hot right now.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot more portion of people, seems like, wanting to come out of a pre-sale that they bought 2-3 years ago, which is understandable because a lot of circumstances change. There's higher chance of some circumstance changing within 2-3 years versus a couple of months from the time you put an offer for typical used properties. And they want to back out of it. And principle applies exactly the same whether you have signed a pre-sale contract or a typical used property contract. And in the legal perspective, the court will always enforce what you promised in the contract, because ultimately contract is a promise between two parties. Buyer have agreed to pay X number of money to the seller, and the seller have promised to, by accepting that money, give the keys and the property title to the buyer. And so as a buyer, if you have failed to make that payment to the seller on the date that's specified that you both agreed on the contract, then the seller has two options typically from a legal point of view. One is what's called specific performance, which means that you'll be forced to carry out that contract, which could mean that the seller is willing to give you the title, so you have to pay this amount and buy this thing, whether you like it or not, because that's what you agreed on and that's what you're going to be held against. Second thing is, and more common thing, is for the buyer to have to pay the damages or the loss to the seller for you breaking your promise in the contract. And this is where we talked about how a lot of buyers have misconception that only thing and the worst thing that would happen to you is just losing your deposit that you put down. That's not necessarily the case, although in reality, that does happen quite a bit. And the reason for that is because, like I said, the seller is entitled to the loss of damage that they incurred because you broke the contract. And that loss might go over what the damage, deposit damage you put down. So the biggest, a lot of example that I give to my clients when they talk to me about this is I give an example closer to home in the city of Surrey, which is just one city next from us here. That happened in 2017, where the buyer agreed to buy a property and remove subject, and then in the middle of it, decide not to buy it and thought, well, I mean, I'm just going to lose a deposit, and I'm okay with that, and decide to walk away. Seller sued the buyer, and the court rewarded the seller 6 times what the deposit amount was originally. And that was done in taking account for what the totality of the loss the seller suffered. That included not only the deposit, but the difference in the purchase or the sale price that they were able to get from the original contract to what they were subsequently able to resell it when they relisted it about a few months after. And that was about $300,000. So they were ordered to pay $300,000. And that's always the risk that you have as a buyer. Once you sign the contract, at the end of the day, the court is gonna try everything they can to hold you accountable for that. So it is something that you cannot back out of.
Yeah, I think that's really, really valuable information, because I do agree that a lot of people like have that misconception that it's just the deposit. And I mean, I guess in an upwards market where things are selling for more and more, you know, every week, sometimes even every day,
That's right.
Yeah, you're probably just going to lose your deposit because the seller can go around and like sell it for more right after you if you don't end up completing for the most part. But people don't realize that like if you're in a down market, like that difference between what they sold it for versus what they can sell it for now, if the market's shifted downwards, is going to be a damage that somebody could sue for. So
yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's something that's really hard to predict because the market can change quite a bit within a couple of months. And you know, having to relist and having to resell can take a couple of months to a couple of you know, few months. And within that time, it can turn. So it's really tough. From the seller point of view too, it's not ideal. Sometimes I get from seller's point of view, they go, well, I mean, then I am legally entitled to receive whatever the contract was anyway, eventually. So I don't need to really try, you know, I can just sue them and get my money back. Well, yes and no. The reality is you don't know how the court will decide. And even if theoretically you have right under the seller to receive compensation, but having a theoretical sort of right and actually carrying that out and receiving that fund in practice, in real world, can be a two different thing. Because of course, even if the court rewarded you the X number of you know, compensation, which typically could have taken 6 months to a year for that actually judgment to come out, for you to actually collect on it, that can take an additional year or two. And that's a lot of headache, and that's a lot of time you wasted. So of course, it's best if you can try to avoid all these sort of things altogether by, from a seller point of view too, you know, it's not just if you're going, okay, well, I want a subject free offer, and that's the best thing because it just makes it easier, it takes headache out of my head. I mean, yes and no, it all depends, but it goes both ways because you're gonna be tied up in the court battle as well for as long as the buyer have to.
Another thing that I was just thinking too is like, it's not always just the case where the seller is listing. Obviously, there's a lot of people that sell and buy, and that if you're
That's
a
right.
buyer that doesn't complete on a seller's listing, that money at the end of the day is probably going to go towards funding their purchase, and it's this domino effect. So it affects a lot of people, and I think the point that we're getting at is don't write a subject-free offer if you can't complete. And also, it's just not the safest thing to write a subject-free offer in the first place. So at the very least, if you feel like you're in a situation where you have to do it, make sure you still do your due diligence.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's that every buyer and seller have their level of comfort and the amount of risk that they want to take on. It is obviously part of a strategy that a lot of buyers use to get an edge over others, and it can pay off, by able to write a contract and offer that is more attractive at a perhaps less, purchase price. But of course, high risk, high gain, and also there's a risk that follows that as well.
Yeah.
You have to really know and do your checks and do your preparation before you get into a subject-free offer.
Yeah. And that was kind of my next thing is like, which basically you just covered, is like, what should people be doing prior to writing if they do decide that they want to take the risk of writing a subject-free offer? And I think that, like you said, it's, do your due diligence, check your stuff, check your title, check your PDS, try and get that inspection done in advance if you can. Involve like your legal rep, your realtor, your mortgage broker, all before you write the offer, so that we can kind of anticipate or let you know any issues that we see moving forward. So just make sure you still do your preparation. And in line with the preparation conversation here, I kind of wanted to move towards the property disclosure statement in replace of an inspection, because I think that this is a big thing that a lot of people think they can do, but isn't really the safest thing to do. And I want to talk about the property disclosure statement, like legally, and how much people can really rely on that property disclosure statement. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, property disclosure statement is a very interesting document, and it's very sometimes give a false illusion to a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
What a lot of people don't realize is that property disclosure statement is not a mandatory part of the contract.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not included. And one other thing that a lot of times people don't realize is that property disclosure statement does not automatically become part of the contract unless you specifically mention it that it is.
Yeah.
So with the property disclosure statement and the contract purchase and sale that's used predominantly in BC, that's produced by Canadian Bar Association and Greater Vancouver Real Estate Board, will say at the very top that unless that this property disclosure statement is mentioned and is incorporated as part of the contract, specifically in the contract, it does not form part of the contract. If it doesn't form part of the contract, it's nothing but a informational, nice to know document.
Okay.
And a lot of times,
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of times, a lot of realtors don't know that either. And I see a lot of contract come through that does not have that specific clause mentioned in the contract. So just make sure that that's in there. Second thing is that even if it's incorporated, there's a common law duty where it's called caveat emptor, which means buyers beware. The responsibility and the onus is always going to fall on the buyer to do their checks to make sure that they are aware and happy with what they're buying for the condition that you're buying it to, because the contract that you're signing will typically have a viewing date as well. And that viewing date will say that you as a buyer view this property on this date, and the seller is agreeing to sell you this property at a substantially similar condition as you viewed it that day, so that you as a buyer have essentially, assessed the property value based on that day you viewed it and have determined that here's what I am willing to offer you, and that's what the seller accepted. You can't go back based on that, away from that, and say, well, actually this doesn't work really well and that doesn't work really well, when you have also already made that offer and you had the opportunity to check and observe what you're buying.
Right.
So there's that two things there.
But
third thing,
me is like,
yeah,
the property disclosure statement, and like people like, so for those of you guys that don't know, the property disclosure statement is a document that gets filled out by the seller and has all these questions like history of wind, fire, or water damage, or are there any additions that were done, or is there infestation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you say that, it's like, what's the point of this property disclosure statement if
absolutely, yeah,
basically like not to be relied upon, and like even if they answer it wrong or like lie about it, it's still buyers beware, and you should have gone and done your due diligence and gotten your inspection to figure out that we answered this wrong because maybe we forgot. Like,
yeah,
kind of silly, because it seems like you can't really do too much if you were to figure out that they lied. How do you prove that they lied and not forgot or something like that?
Yes, that's the thing, because the wording that's used in the property disclosure statement is to the best of the seller's knowledge. It's not factual as to this is working, that's working. This is for the seller as an information purposes, mostly to say that based on best of my knowledge, here is what the property's condition is.
Right.
And that's more intended to be used as a guideline or a starting point, but it's hard to nail that down, because at the end of the day, once it goes to court, there's a very big gap sometimes based on what you know versus what you can prove. And so what you know, that seller had a knowledge or not, and being able to prove that somebody had knowledge of something or have intentionally deceived something to gain benefit is two different things. Because not only you're having to prove that the property is not working or are working factually, but that the seller had knowledge that it was not working or intentionally deceived you or deceit to gain benefit. And that is a much more tricky sort of thing to nail down.
Sounds like a headache.
It is a headache. And ultimately, what I always tell my clients is that once you handed the money over, it's not easy to get it back. Yeah. It never is. So it's always good to do your checks. And I mean, I can go on about the legal sort of concept of latent defect versus patent defect and whose responsibility is to check it and not check it and stuff like that. But ultimately, the seller, at the same time, if it's something that's visible, because the buyer has responsibility to check it for patent defects, that they do not have legal duty to disclose it. If there is something that is not reasonably visible for doing a reasonable checks, that is, let's say, underground oil tank, or mold behind, or things like that, that is not so visible that you can't discover based on reasonable inspection, then the seller does have a duty to disclose it. But if not, it's on sellers. And like I said, even if you have a theoretical right to receive compensation because seller wronged you, actually carrying that out and putting that in practice and receiving actual compensation in real life is not easy. So do your checks before you go.
I feel like we could do a whole other video on like, don't rely on the property disclosure statement, or like defects and all these things. And sorry, I cut you off before the third point, but it just gets me so riled up. It's like, I don't understand what the point is.
Yeah, it's like a property disclosure statement has let you down.
It has. I thought about it. Like, it's a subject I put on all my contracts. I'm supposed to put it there.
Yeah.
They let me down. But did you have anything else to say about it, or is it basically just buyer beware, don't rely on it? It's not a replacement for the inspection.
Yeah, it's not a replacement for inspection by any means. And it's, like I said, really, really hard to enforce what they gave you, what they disclosed there, because it's based on their best knowledge. It's not to guarantee that this is working. It's to say that, to best of my knowledge, I think it's working.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it's not working.
I thought it was, and now it's not.
My bad. You know, and you then, after that, it's on the buyers to try to prove that they had, you know, knowledge of it before and intentionally deceived you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can redeem myself with warrant. Okay. So my next question was around warrants. So in contracts, a lot of the times you'll see something like, you know, the seller warrants that on the possession day, all of the plumbing, electrical, fireplace, et cetera, will be in proper working order. And if it's not, then what happens? So that's basically my question, but I guess, can we start with what is a warrant? Yeah,
and I feel like the word warrant is going to also let you down a little bit here too, Mariko. But warrant is, it might sound something really crazy, but it really is just a promise too. It's the seller saying, I warrant, essentially, I promise that this item will work.
Yeah.
It's no different than something that we're probably more familiar with, like a warranty, right? You buy a vacuum cleaner and you have a 1-year manufacturer warranty. What that is that essentially the manufacturer is saying to the consumer that I promise you that this product, as I'm selling it to you and you agreeing to buy this at that price, that it will actually work properly for 1 year. And if it doesn't, then because I promised, I will fix it for you at no cost. And so it's very similar to that. It's the seller promising you that I promise that this property will work when you buy it. Now, the tricky thing, like I said, is that, first of all, as we talked about already, that having that promise there, and if the seller breaches it, for you to actually, in practice, receiving that compensation is tricky thing. And second, unlike 1 year or 2 year warranty you receive as a consumer from manufacturer, this warranty is only valid on the date of either completion or possession, whatever you put in the contract. And that also is a very elusive thing, as you can imagine. And I have a lot of times, especially for my business clients who's buying a restaurant or other business where there's a lot of equipment involved, and sometimes some equipment can be high in its value, who don't do proper checks on those as well. And once they buy, let's say, a walk-in cooler that's worth $50,000 or $100,000 sometimes, and realize that it's not working properly. I can go on about the definition of proper, because that is also elusive thing. A lot of times it's a proper working order, or is it a good working order? Proper just means it's working properly. And that can be an elusive thing, and that's a gray area where, let's say, a walk-in cooler that's worth, like I said, $100,000, it could be working properly based on the fact that it's a 10-year-old cooler, that it goes to -3 degrees, but you have a sushi restaurant and the health department requires you to have -5 cooler because it is you keep raw fish in there, frozen. It's properly working. It's just not meeting the standard of Health Canada, but there was no contract that contemplated whether it was meeting a specific health order. It just required the equipment to be working properly. So there's that issue. And second issue is, at what point did it not work? To try to, again, knowing that versus proving that is a very different thing, because if you can say that, well, it's not working now, well, it's been a week, let's say. It seems silly logically, but legally, the seller can say, well, I can tell you that my argument to you is that, and my position is that it was working on the day that I handed you the keys. Something must have happened between that 1 week period where it's not working now. Now the buyer, of course, even the seller warranted on the day of completion, now you're sitting there making the accusation a week after that the equipment's not working. And you, again, onus is for you to try to prove to court that reasonably the equipment was not working on the time that the key was handed over. And that means you have to get typically expert witnesses who's willing to testify on your behalf based on their expert knowledge that, you know, their equipment was already not working on the time, you know, in the past. And you can imagine, again, the headache that goes through your head as I'm talking about this. And you're probably desired to go, well, warrant is useless, and that's too much headache that I don't want to get into. It's better than nothing. Absolutely. It's better than not having it there. But you can see the point, kind of recurring theme is that if you hand over the money and try to get that back, it's a lot of headache involved.
Yeah, I guess it just comes back to what you said. You give the money, don't really expect it back. And I guess like a lot of these lawsuits are probably more expensive than maybe going out and buying, say, like a new washer dryer combo, if that's the issue on the day of possession, unfortunately, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
But it is the unfortunate truth a lot of the time. One question that I have just quickly, well, two kind of, is that, so say you check everything on the possession day. I mean, the nature of real estate is that the completion comes first. So you give your money first and then you have your possession after. Even if you check everything on the possession day, you've still given your money. So if it doesn't work, like, you have to go after them after you've already given your money. So that's my question number one, is what you would do in a situation where you had the possession and you check things on the possession day. And my question number two is, in my contracts at least, I always add a term in there just saying that they can come back prior to the completion just to do kind of like a pre-walkthrough and check everything. Is that something that you still think is helpful, just to maybe say like, oh, hey, I noticed that this isn't working. Don't forget about that warrant that we have for things to be working on the possession day, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so yeah, that's also a pronged question there that I can go on quite a bit. But it's also, yes, because the contract for your purchase and sale of the property, the big sort of responsibility, what we call essential term of the contract, is for the buyer to give this money that you agreed to on this day, and the seller to give you the title to the property, that if small issues in the big picture of things, an equipment or like a refrigerator not working properly, is not typically form essential part of the contract unless you specify that it is, which means that if you decided, you did a walkthrough and you decided, okay, well, the refrigerator is not really working properly, which, like I said, is a gray area. First of all, right? But let's say you're just not happy subjectively from the buyer point of view that the refrigerator doesn't seem to be too cold. That doesn't give you a legal right to breach your responsibility to pay the seller the amount of money on the date that you promised, typically, unless it is something that you specifically put in the contract to be the essential term of the contract. So unfortunately, if the money has already been handed over, and even if money has not been handed over, but it's completing tomorrow, if the seller is not meeting your demand, or of course has agreed to fix or reduce the price of the property to compensate you for it, does not give the buyer an automatic right to breach something in the contract of their own and not meet their responsibility. It's a lot of times the responsibility I use is that, unfortunately, as much as it would feel real good to, if you're walking down the street and if someone punches you in the face, and as wrong as that is, does not give you a right to punch that person back in the face in response, unless, of course, you can justify it as a self-defense. And of course, there's a lot of exceptions for contract law counterpart as well. But it's the same thing. If the seller wronged you on something, it does not give you right to wrong them back. You would, in theory, like how it is, you have to call the police and report that person for assault, and then they go to jail and they get their sort of legal consequences.
Yeah.
Similar thing for the contract law too. If the seller wronged you, you have to still complete, you pay your dues, and you have to go through court to get the compensation that you are owed, which is obviously not something you might prefer, but that's the sort of legal system we have. And so the best thing, of course, you can do is what I tell a lot of times as well, for a lot of, especially my business clients, where there's a lot of equipment involved that's pricey, is that even if it costs you a little extra, couple $100 or even more, to have like a proper certified technician or expert to come and do a proper checks of all the equipments or other things like inspectors, and know fully well what you're getting into before you buy. At least give yourself a bit of time, even if you're writing a subject-free offer. As soon as that offer is accepted, give yourself ability in the contract to go and do an inspection or have ability to go in the premise to do your checks, and bring someone that knows and are experts in those areas that can check, so that if you do discover something, it gives you a little more time than a day or two before completion to try to negotiate different terms.
Yeah. Okay, Paul.
Bad, isn't it?
Driving a stake through my heart.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a sad thing we have here, unfortunately.
Oh my God. And you know, just so everybody else knows, our intention was to keep this video below 15 minutes. And we
never do.
Go off on these tangents. I don't know if anyone else is interested in all of these things, but we're interested.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting stuff, and even if everybody doesn't find it interesting, it's still valuable. It's good to know, and I think that there are a lot of clients that I have that like wouldn't agree with what you're saying in terms of like what they think it should be.
Yes.
It's different between what a buyer thinks they should be entitled to versus what the reality of the legal process.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying all legal process is logical, and I disagree with a whole bunch of them too myself, but that's the unfortunate sort of framework we have to work
enforcer.
with. Yeah, I'm the deliverer of the bad news, and that's the unfortunate part. But you know, I do have to inform them, and they can make the full decision with the full information they have. The decision is theirs, but you know, my responsibility to just give them a realistic sort of option and the you know, consequences that might come after the fact. Yeah.
Well, it's good to know. So even though I'm shaking my head at a lot of what you're saying, I still really appreciate you, Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we went from everything from subject-free offers to me being upset about warrants and the property statement. We talked about the risks, and so hopefully this video was helpful for you guys. I think I'm gonna have to put a lot of different captions and points so that you guys can skip through the video and rewatch certain things. And yeah, hopefully this video was helpful. If you guys want us to talk about anything else, if you have any questions that come out of it, we could have probably done a part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4.
Absolutely,
so we can keep going, and if there's anything you guys want us to unpack, definitely let me know in the comments below. Thank you again, Paul, for joining me on the video today and being the bearer of some bad news.
Yeah.
But it's always good to have you on, and I really appreciate your time. So thanks for joining us. And if you guys need any help with title transfers, notary related things, definitely reach out to Paul anytime. He's right around the Lougheed area, and I'm sure he's more than happy to help you.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking time to joining us, and I'm sure we'll give you more bad news later on. On different
keep it rolling. All the legal videos.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys.